They told you it was protection. God is always watching. A comfort. A reminder that you're never alone, that someone cares about every step you take. But somewhere between childhood and adulthood, it stopped feeling like love. It started feeling like surveillance. And here's what nobody in that Sunday school classroom ever explained to you. There is a measurable, documented psychological difference between feeling loved and feeling watched. One builds people up, the other quietly dismantles them. So today we're not asking whether God exists. We're asking something far more uncomfortable. What does believing in a God who never looks away actually do to a human mind? The answer might change how you think about faith, fear, and freedom forever. The eye that never blinks. Picture this. You're at work. Your boss is standing directly behind you, just watching, not saying anything, not helping, just observing every keystroke, every pause, every sigh. How productive are you? How free do you feel? Now imagine that boss never leaves. Not when you sleep, not when you shower, not when you have a private thought at 2 a.m. that you're ashamed of. And unlike your actual boss, this one has no blind spots. No moments of distraction. No end to the workday where you finally clock out and exhale. The observation is total. It is permanent. It has been there since before you could speak. That's not a metaphor. That's what millions of children are taught is God. Not as a frightening thing, mind you. It's presented warmly, lovingly, even. God sees everything you do is delivered with a smile, in the same tone as God loves you. And as a child, you don't yet have the psychological vocabulary to notice the contradiction sitting inside that sentence. Because love and surveillance are not the same thing. And your nervous system knows the difference, even when your theology doesn't. Psychologists have a term for what happens to a mind that never fully escapes observation. They call it hypervigilance. It's a state of chronic alertness where the brain remains locked in low-level threat detection because it has learned that the environment is always watching, always evaluating, always ready to respond to a misstep. The body never fully unwinds. The breath never fully settles. There is always, somewhere beneath the surface, a quiet hum of exposure. This isn't spiritual sensitivity. This isn't holy awareness. This is what the nervous system does when it cannot find safety. When rest feels like risk. When privacy feels like an illusion. And here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Hypervigilance is not a gift. It is not a sign of devotion or moral seriousness. It is a trauma response. It is what develops in children who grow up in unpredictable environments where they were never quite sure if they were safe. The fact that the source of observation is divine does not change what it does to a developing mind. If anything, it makes it harder to name, harder to question, and far, far harder to heal. When shame became the sermon, the theology of divine observation didn't begin as cruelty. It began as crowd control. Ancient societies needed moral order, and they needed it desperately. There were no police forces, no surveillance cameras, no legal system sophisticated enough to catch every thief, every liar, every person who took more than their share under cover of darkness. So communities reached for something more powerful than any human institution. They reached for the infinite. And what better enforcer than an invisible, all-knowing authority? You couldn't bribe God. You couldn't hide from God. You couldn't construct an alibi that God would believe. God saw you steal that fig. God saw you lust after your neighbor's wife. God saw the lie you told in the dark when no one else was in the room. The system was elegant in its simplicity. Make people believe the cosmos itself is watching, and you don't need a guard on every corner. This worked. Communities became more cooperative. Antisocial behavior dropped. Social trust increased. Scholars of evolutionary psychology and anthropology have documented this across cultures and centuries. The watching God was genuinely useful. It was one of humanity's most effective social technologies. And for a long time, the benefits were real enough that nobody examined the price too closely. But there was a cost buried deep in the architecture of this belief. A slow, structural damage that didn't show up immediately. It showed up in people, in the texture of their inner lives. Because when the fear of being seen becomes the primary motivator for goodness, something essential gets quietly corrupted at the root. You are no longer good because you care about other people. You are no longer honest because honesty reflects something you genuinely value. You are good because you are terrified of what happens if you are not. And that is a completely different psychological experience, even when the behavior looks identical from the outside. Psychologists call this the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation comes from within. It is durable, flexible, and tends to grow stronger over time. Extrinsic motivation comes from outside pressure, reward, or fear. It works in the short term, but it is brittle. Remove the observer, and the behavior often collapses with it. More importantly, it never builds genuine character. It builds performance. And when external surveillance replaces internal values over a lifetime, shame floods the space where integrity used to live. Shame is not the same thing as conscience, and this distinction matters more than most sermons ever had the courage to admit. Conscience says, I hurt someone, and I want to make it right. Shame says, I am broken, and I cannot be fixed. One is a compass, the other is a cage. One moves you toward repair. The other convinces you that repair was never really possible for someone like you. Generations of believers were handed the cage and told it was wisdom, the Panopticon you carry inside your head. In 1791, a philosopher named Jeremy Bentham designed a prison with a single, chilling idea at its center. One guard tower, surrounded by cells on all sides. Every prisoner visible at all times, but crucially, the prisoners could never see whether the guard was actually watching at any given moment. The tower's windows were angled. The lighting was controlled. You could see the tower, but you could never see into it. So the prisoners had to assume the worst, always. Every moment of every day, they behaved as though the eye was on them, because the cost of being wrong was too high. Bentham called it the Panopticon, and he believed it was the most efficient form of control ever devised by a human mind. Not because it watched people, but because it made people watch themselves. You don't need a guard in every cell if you can architect the space so that every prisoner becomes their own guard. The institution shrinks, the compliance remains. It was, in Bentham's own estimation, a masterpiece of psychological engineering. Michel Foucault, one of the 20th century's most penetrating social thinkers, later argued that this logic didn't stay in prisons, it spread. Into schools, into hospitals, into governments, and perhaps most completely, into religion. The God who watches isn't only a theological claim about the nature of the divine, it is an architecture of consciousness, a way of constructing the surveillance so deeply inside a person that the institution no longer needs to enforce it from the outside. The church doesn't need to follow you home. It already lives in your head. You become your own warden. You police your own thoughts before they fully form. You feel guilt for impulses you never acted on, shame for questions you were afraid to finish asking, anxiety about desires that harmed no one. The guard tower is empty half the time. It doesn't matter. You stopped checking years ago. And wardens don't rest. They can't afford to. Neither, it turns out, can you. What the research actually shows. Let's leave philosophy for a moment and walk into the laboratory, because this is where the conversation stops being theoretical and starts being personal. In 2012, researchers at Queen's University in Canada ran a series of experiments on moral behavior and religious priming. The setup was careful, and the results were striking. When participants were subtly reminded of a watchful, punishing God before making decisions, something predictable happened. They became more compliant, more rule-following, more likely to conform to expected moral behavior. On the surface, it looked like exactly what the theology promised. The watching God produces better people. But here is the twist that never makes it into the sermon. Those same participants also became more anxious, more prone to guilt spirals after minor transgressions, less likely to forgive themselves when they made mistakes, even small and inconsequential ones. The obedience went up, the self-compassion went down. They were more controlled and less free, and the research couldn't find a way to separate those two outcomes. They arrived together, like two sides of the same coin that nobody had thought to flip over. This wasn't an isolated finding. A separate and substantial body of research on what psychologists call authoritarian religious styles the kind characterized by that ever-watching, ever-judging divine figure, consistently links this framework to higher rates of generalized anxiety disorder, to OCD-like rumination, where the mind loops endlessly over past behavior looking for evidence of failure, and to a condition researchers have named scrupulosity, a compulsive and genuinely exhausting obsession with one's own sinfulness that can become so consuming it interferes with basic daily functioning. People caught in scrupulosity don't just feel bad about things they've done, they feel cosmically, permanently, irreparably guilty for simply being human. It is important to say this clearly. The people experiencing this are not weak. They are not failures of faith. They are not lacking in spiritual discipline. Their nervous systems are responding exactly as nervous systems do when placed under conditions of inescapable observation and judgment. The theology is doing precisely what it was designed to do. The only question worth sitting with is whether that design still serves the people living inside it, the God who loves versus the God who watches. Not all conceptions of God produce this outcome. And this is where the conversation shifts from critique into something more nuanced, because what the research reveals here is not an argument against faith. It is something far more precise and far more unsettling than that. When researchers began distinguishing between what they call an authoritarian God and a benevolent God, they expected to find differences in behavior. What they didn't fully anticipate was how completely opposite the psychological profiles of believers would turn out to be. The authoritarian God is punishing, all-seeing, and demanding. A divine presence defined primarily by its standards and its willingness to enforce them. The benevolent God is loving, forgiving, and present in a way that feels supportive rather than supervisory. Same religion in many cases, often the same scripture, the same prayers said in the same buildings by people sitting in adjacent pews. And yet, the internal experience of those two believers is so different that psychologically, they might as well be practicing entirely separate faiths. Believers in a loving God consistently show lower anxiety, higher self-compassion, greater ability to recover after failure rather than collapsing into shame. They make mistakes and return to themselves more quickly, because the God they carry in their minds responds to failure the way a genuinely loving parent does, with disappointment perhaps, but without condemnation. Without the withdrawal of fundamental worth, believers in a watching God show the opposite pattern across nearly every measure. More rumination, more perfectionism, more difficulty distinguishing between making a mistake and being a mistake. The data on this is not subtle, which means the damage was never coming from faith itself. It was never an inevitable feature of believing in something larger than yourself. It was coming from a specific metaphor, a specific frame that someone somewhere decided to place at the center of the tradition. A frame chosen, consciously or not, because fear is a more reliable short-term motivator than love. Because a congregation kept in mild anxiety is easier to manage than one that feels genuinely, unconditionally accepted. Fear fills the seats, love might eventually empty them. But short-term motivation always carries long-term consequences. And those consequences are walking into therapists' offices every single day, still trying to find the words for something that started in a place they were told was holy. The child who could never be good enough. Think about what it means to grow up under the gaze of a perfect being, not a flawed parent who sometimes gets it wrong and comes back the next morning to apologize. Not a human teacher who loses patience on a bad day and then recalibrates. Not a coach or a mentor or a friend who sees your limits and respects them because they have limits too. A perfect observer, infinite in standards, eternal in memory, one who does not forget, does not tire, does not offer the mercy of a bad day where maybe they weren't paying close attention. Every thought counts. Every impulse is cataloged before you've even decided what to do with it. Every moment of doubt is not a sign of a curious mind, but a spiritual failure requiring correction. Every flash of anger, every selfish desire, every second of boredom during prayer is evidence entered into a record that never expires. You are being graded on the content of your own consciousness, and the grader has perfect recall and infinite time. Now, put that framework inside a child's developing mind. A mind that is still learning what it is, still constructing its relationship with its own interior world, still figuring out whether its thoughts and feelings are safe to have. Children raised inside this framework don't just struggle with perfectionism in the ordinary sense. They often develop what clinical psychologists describe as an internal persecutory object, an internalized voice that has absorbed all the qualities of that divine observer and taken up permanent residence in the psyche. A voice that is never satisfied, never reassured, never quiet. One that meets every achievement with a reminder of what still falls short, and meets every failure with a verdict rather than a question. You probably know this voice. You may be listening to it right now, in the back of your mind, evaluating whether you're engaging with this video seriously enough, whether you're a good enough person, whether you've done enough today to justify existing comfortably in your own skin. Even if you left the faith 20 years ago, the voice didn't leave with you. It was never really housed in the church. It was housed in you. It learned to speak in the language of your childhood, in the cadence of those early lessons about who God was and what God required. And it has been fluent ever since, long after you stopped believing the theology that built it. That is not holiness. That is not the fruit of genuine spiritual formation. That is a wound that learned to sound like wisdom, shaped so carefully like a belief that most people never think to question whether it belongs to them at all. Why we accepted the bargain. So why did we accept this? Why did generation after generation, across cultures and centuries and wildly different circumstances, internalize a God whose gaze was more prosecutorial than loving? Why did people who were clearly intelligent, clearly feeling, clearly capable of noticing the anxiety this produced, keep passing it to their children anyway? Because it offered something precious in return. Something so valuable that the psychological cost felt not just acceptable, but reasonable. It offered certainty in a world that was, for most of human history, almost incomprehensibly brutal in its randomness. Plague arrived without warning. Children died before they could speak. Crops failed. Empires collapsed. Violence came from directions you hadn't thought to watch. And in the middle of all of that chaos, all of that suffering that followed, no visible logic, the watching God provided something no other explanation could fully deliver. It meant someone knew the full story. It meant that the widow who watched her husband die slowly and painfully was not simply a victim of indifferent biology. It meant the person who was cheated, abused, or destroyed by someone more powerful than them had not simply lost. The wicked would be punished. The innocent would be vindicated. The score was being kept by someone with perfect information and infinite patience, and the final accounting was coming whether you lived to see it or not. That promise sits at the intersection of humanity's deepest needs: the need for justice, the need for meaning, the need to believe that suffering is not simply noise, that your pain registers somewhere in the fabric of the universe, that your life and your losses matter to someone beyond the people who happen to share your immediate circumstances. Psychologists who study meaning-making consistently find this need near the center of human motivation. We can endure almost anything if we believe it means something. We struggle enormously with pain that means nothing at all. The anxiety was the price of admission. And for most of human history, in most of the conditions our ancestors actually lived in, it was a price worth paying. The certainty was worth the surveillance. The cosmic justice was worth the cosmic observation. But the question we face now is a different one, because the world has changed in ways our ancestors could not have anticipated. We have built other structures for meaning, other communities of accountability, other ways of sitting with suffering that don't require an infinite observer to make it bearable. We have psychology, philosophy, science, and each other in ways that are genuinely new. And some of those ways, it turns out, don't require us to feel watched every second of every day just to feel that our lives are worth living. Leaving the gaze, and what comes next. Here is something nobody tells you when you deconstruct this belief. When you finally examine the theology, find it wanting, and set it down. When you walk away from the framework that housed your childhood and shaped your nervous system and told you who you were in relation to the infinite, nobody warns you about what comes next. Because the assumption is that once the belief goes, the burden goes with it. That clarity is the same thing as relief. But the anxiety doesn't always leave when the theology does. And this catches people completely off guard. They expect to feel free. Sometimes they do, briefly. And then, the voice returns, speaking in its familiar register, and they realize with a particular kind of exhaustion that the voice was never really coming from outside them at all. It was never really God's voice, it was theirs. Built by them, or rather built into them, assembled brick by brick from every sermon absorbed before they had the critical vocabulary to question it, every punishment that taught them their inner life was dangerous, every moment of being told that their thoughts and impulses and doubts were visible to someone with both the knowledge and the authority to condemn them for having them. The theology provided the initial scaffolding, but over time, the person became the structure. And structures don't dissolve simply because you've stopped believing in the blueprints. This is why so many people who leave authoritarian religious environments find, sometimes years later, that they are still living inside the same psychological architecture they thought they had abandoned. Still struggling with shame that arrives before any conscious thought about wrongdoing. Still caught in perfectionism that no achievement can satisfy. Still carrying the bone-deep sense that they are fundamentally too much in some ways and not enough in all the ways that matter. The institution is gone. The pattern remains. The work of actually leaving, the real leaving, is not intellectual. Reading the right books helps. Understanding the psychology helps. But the work that actually changes the nervous system is slower and less comfortable than acquiring new ideas. It is neurological, it is emotional, it is relational. It is the gradual, patient, often frustrating process of learning that you are allowed to exist without an audience evaluating your worth in real time. That a thought that crosses your mind does not make you evil. That a mistake does not place you beyond the reach of repair. That the people who love you are not doing so provisionally, waiting for the moment you finally reveal yourself to be too broken to deserve it. And then there is the hardest part, the part that doesn't get talked about enough in either religious or secular spaces. The only gaze you are ever truly, meaningfully accountable to in your daily lived experience is your own, not a parent's, not a congregation's, not a divine observer's, yours. Which means the work, ultimately, is learning to make that gaze kind. Learning to look at yourself the way you might look at someone you love who is struggling. With honesty, yes. With standards, yes. But without the cold, exhausting, relentless prosecution that so many people mistake for moral seriousness. That is not a small thing. That is not a simple thing. But it is, in every sense that actually matters, a spiritual practice. And it might be the most important one you ever undertake. So where does this leave us? Not with a verdict on God. Not with an argument that faith itself is the problem. But with a question that deserves an honest answer from every person who was handed a belief system before they were old enough to evaluate it. What kind of God have you been taught to believe in? Because the God who watches and the God who loves are not the same God. They build different people, different nervous systems, different relationships with failure, with forgiveness, with the face in the mirror. Genuine spiritual health, whatever form it takes for you, does not make you smaller. It does not require you to live under permanent suspicion of your own interior life. It does not confuse anxiety with devotion or obedience, born from fear with genuine goodness. It makes you more human, more free, more capable of extending to others the grace you were never quite allowed to give yourself. If this gave you words for something you have been carrying quietly for a long time, share it with someone who needs permission to breathe. Subscribe if you value truth over comfort. And keep questioning. The truth has never been afraid of a good question.